Okay, my name is Esther Stanford Jose. I am, my profession is a jurisconsult, basically, which is a specialist in jurisprudence. And jurisprudence is the science and the philosophy of law, and in particular how we look at law, how it gets applied in the real world. I trained as a barrister, but am non-practicing. Didn't go through the full stage of becoming a barrister, because part of the reason why I wanted to become a barrister was because of the notion of the power of law in affecting change. And when I was actually doing my legal education and training, I remember one of my law professors basically saying, "This is all theory what we're doing here. In practice it doesn't work like this." And so I've actually spent most of my adult life engaged in what's called legal literacy, which is really enabling those who have not formally been schooled in law to understand their role not only in law implementation but shaping and making of law, and in particular challenging unjust law. So yes, my work really focuses around raising legal consciousness so that we can understand how we can use law as a tool of resistance and liberation, because it has often been misused as a tool of oppression. So it's quite a specialist field, because even within conventional law there are many different schools, and I come from a school of law that's called critical law, which basically looks at law in its social, political and economic context, as opposed to what's traditionally called black letter law, which is very much the law of the statute books, as though it's come from on high, and we have no role in actually changing it, in shaping it or translating it. And the history of our people, and certainly our liberation struggle, is that we have shaped law. We have been makers of law. We have broken unjust laws in order to bring about a more just situation.
And that leads us neatly into my next question, really, which was, define reparations, the principles of reparations in the context of the journey of African people.
Well, reparations, in terms of the word, it really sort of comes from the French réparer, and it has kind of three interconnected meanings: to restore, to make amends, and also to renew, and to repair. So essentially, reparations is commonly understood as repairing harm, damage, wrongs, injuries to individuals, peoples and groups that have been affected by various forms of oppression or violations of their human and or people's rights. So that's the basic definition and understanding of reparations. Within our people's struggle for liberation and to restore ourselves, reparations has come to represent not only a political struggle and a legal claim or a case, but more significantly a social movement to actually restore us as a people, as in fact a nation, to our rightful place on this planet as mothers and fathers of human civilization. So the reparations movement, as it's commonly called today, is really a global, what's called social movement, which is aimed to bring about social change, social transformation, and to repair some of the damage that we have experienced as a result of enslavement and colonialism and their shared legacies which remain with us today.
That's quite a comprehensive overview of reparations, because a lot of people would simplify it as just down to monetary return. What would you say to that?
Well, that has become an approach to reparations that's in particular been very common in the last, I'd say, 20 or 30 years. And there's different phases in the reparations movement, if you like. And that's one of the more modern phase, where we've become sort of very engrossed in a global economic system that's really based on capitalism. And that has also defined many of the strategies for liberation that we seek to take. Now, compensation is only one aspect of reparation. So it's an aspect that has become overemphasized in modern times, and I wouldn't dismiss it totally. However, it is not the most significant part of reparations. Also, I believe that the mass media, the corporate global neoliberal mass media, has had a huge role to play in actually creating this situation in the public consciousness that reparations is synonymous with money, because it also serves a particular agenda of the powers that be to actually create an impression that all we want is a bunch of money, to actually turn people away from supporting the cause of reparations and truly actually working in solidarity with us, as has always been the case throughout our freedom struggle. Our freedom struggle has always garnered the support of non-Africans who were conscientious and who saw the righteousness and the rightness of what we were seeking to do. Now, there is something called the International Framework on Reparations, which is some international principles which are based on, they're actually called the Van Boven Principles, and they look at what reparations are in a holistic way. And these are principles which have been embraced by the United Nations, and there are 5 key strands to these principles in terms of an international framework on the right to a remedy of reparations for victims of gross violations of human rights and humanitarian rights. Now, the 5 key strands are restitution, which is basically to put a thing, a people, a group back in the position they would have been in had the various violations of their rights not occurred.
Yes.
So in our situation, we're talking about had enslavement and colonialism not occurred, that would be restitution. How do we reclaim everything that has been stolen from us, everything that has been taken from us, and everything that we have lost? There is also rehabilitation, which is quite self-explanatory, but it also includes, the various social welfare reforms that we need and redress to actually rebuild ourselves, re-establish ourselves, looking at social support, even legal services and support, various kinds of provision to do with meeting the everyday, like, basic needs of people. And oftentimes we think of rehabilitation within a specific context of psychological rehabilitation and so forth. There is also compensation, which is basically any kind of loss that we can put a financial value on. So it's not just a simple monetary sum. Compensation can be in money, or it can be in other resources, real property, land, restoration of rights to trade, and that's particularly important, say, in the Caribbean, where we've been particularly affected in terms of, unjust rules of international trade, what's happened to the banana industry, the sugar industry, and how that's had such a huge impact on development, or so-called development, in the Caribbean. Then there's also something called satisfaction, which are all the measures that we would put in place to feel satisfied that we have had some measure of redress, that we've had the correct story told, that the correct narrative remains in the public arena as to what's happened and who were the perpetrators and who were the victims, if you like. So it includes things like commemoration days, changing the names of buildings and landmarks, changing the curriculum, really teaching the truth about a people's journey and their struggle for liberation. So whereas in our freedom struggle, many of those who resisted oppression and enslavement were actually deemed to be terrorists and were deemed to be basically outlaws.
Now, mentally insane.
Exactly. Now that there's a kind of retelling of that and a correction of the narrative. So many of those who were hanged, many of those who were executed for actually engaging in their lawful rights to resist oppression now become celebrated heroes and heroines, etc. The final aspect of these international principles are something called non-repetition. And basically that's a very key aspect of our reparations struggle that has been extremely de-emphasized, because non-repetition basically speaks to all the measures that we put in place to ensure that this never happens again. Enslavement never happens again. Colonialism never happens again. Dispossession of our land and our resources never happens again. Quite clearly, that is happening again. People are still actually being sold into slavery today in terms of chattel slavery. Africans are still being sold into slavery. Our lands are still being stolen from us. Africa is in fact being recolonized. So non-repetition actually speaks to the various measures, and it includes things like holding perpetrators to account.
Yes.
So those are the 5 key strands of a holistic understanding of what reparations entail.
Okay, now you mentioned the word rehabilitation. You struck a chord with me. You also mentioned rehabilitation and used the word psychology in that as well. Now I know there's been quite a lot of research done on post-traumatic slavery syndrome.
Yes.
What's your view on that in terms of rehabilitation, and how can that be implemented as well?
Yes, I mean it's very, very relevant. Post-traumatic slavery syndrome, post-traumatic colonial syndrome, intergenerational Stockholm syndrome, which many of us seem to have, where we over-identify and have this false sense of loyalty to our oppressors and our colonizers. These are psychological legacies that very much disaffect us today as a people and as various individuals within our global nation to different degrees. Even some of us who come across quite well adjusted, I think, have different degrees of this syndrome unless we're constantly working to actually rehabilitate ourselves. So it's extremely relevant, and we know again in our freedom struggle we've always emphasized not only the physical enslavement but actually the mental enslavement. And if you like, that's the more pernicious form of enslavement today, simply because it's the hardest to tackle. At least with physical enslavement, chattel slavery, bondage and so forth, we can see it. It's very visible. But with the mental enslavement, many of us who appear to be normal and well adjusted and even get held up as being people to emulate in our community are actually some of the most mentally enslaved people. So it's very, very relevant. In terms of how it fits in, there has been a very well-defined, well-established constituency of mental health workers, psychologists, psychotherapists, those who kind of deal with the mental sciences, as it were, who have brought these perspectives into the reparations movement and have spoken of the importance of us actually being able to rehabilitate ourselves from mental slavery, to actually reclaim our authentic African mind, because that is what is most under attack today, and that can actually be a key component of our reparations movement as we move forward. Practically, how would it work? There are various strategies to effecting reparations. A common strategy that is, again, quite dominant in modern times is litigation. And so there's been various court cases. Many of them have not won in that kind of conventional sense of winning. However, a kind of claim for psychological repair can actually form parts of any litigation strategies. There's also political strategies. There's what we call the legislative strategies, which are actually more effective, where offending governments actually enact legislation as a form of recompense and redress. And there is also the international movement building, which again has to accompany any of the litigation and the political and the legislative strategies too. So, for instance, we could argue that in order to help repair ourselves, we should have access to culturally appropriate psychological therapies as individuals, within our families and within the wider community. Now that is extremely winnable, because we have certainly in the UK and in other sections of the West where we are dislocated, basically, you find an overrepresentation of people of African origin in mental health service provision. It's actually a huge area of civil rights struggle in the UK at this time. And so if we had our mental health experts and professionals really getting on board the reparations movement, they can actually assist us with providing us with local and regional and national data that we can actually use as a tool to lobby the government, to lobby institutions for change. Because basically this is a very real, concrete legacy of enslavement today.
Well, it seems like a very complex issue, because if some in our community haven't actually acknowledged or taken ownership that they are not operating from within an African mindset, how do you then begin to get to a person like that? And to broaden the question out, would you say that African descendants in the diaspora are in a grip of a Western mindset?
Yes, most definitely we are. I mean, from the time we're born, for those, a lot of us don't go to school, but a lot of us do. The schooling that we receive, it's all Eurocentric. Everything that we learn actually is about Eurocentrism. Basic literacy, numeracy, the frameworks are Eurocentric, all the examples, and then when we go into high school or secondary school, the disciplines that we take up, science, maths and humanities and all kinds of sociology and history, a lot of the disciplines are taught from a Eurocentric perspective. And even though there is inclusion, as they would say, it often happens in a very tokenistic way. So Black History Month, that's when we want to learn, or diversity seminars or what have you, or slavery. That they will recognise slavery, and it's often taught very badly, but what's not taught is who we were before enslavement. So yes, we would be in the we are very much immersed in a Western mindset, and it's become so normal to us, and we have become very functional within it, to the point that we don't recognise that actually, and in fact we don't remember that we were someone else, that we have our own ways of doing things, because Eurocentrism also operates on the principle of putting itself as the universal standard.
Yes.
So it doesn't name itself, it doesn't define itself, it just becomes the objective standard of truth that we emulate. And so when we then start talking about Black history or any other history, that becomes a deviation from the norm. And we know that even the Black history stuff, the majority of our people don't embrace it. It's still very much done in a tokenistic way.
Is there a problem that objective standard you mentioned is alive and kicking on the continent as well, which is affecting our leadership?
Of course, most definitely, because we're all affected by the same sickness. we have to recognise what happened during colonialism. The missionaries, the mercenaries, the colonial schooling that many of our people in Africa and the Caribbean received. Those mission schools were actually schools teaching European indoctrination.
Yes.
They kind of tell us it was about civilization, basically civilizing the natives, bringing us into the modern world, getting rid of some of our backward ways. But actually it was European indoctrination and propaganda. And part of that schooling that we received, and it wasn't only formal schooling, it was the informal schooling, because part of colonialism was about actually disrupting our whole social fabric, and it was actually a cultural genocide that we experienced. And in the framework of genocide, Raphael Lemkin, who is the person, the Polish jurist who coined that term, he actually spoke of the imposition of the national, pattern of the oppressor nation on the oppressed nation.
Yes.
That was actually the preliminary to a physical genocide. It was the cultural genocide. So that was then about instilling European norms, values, cultural frameworks, educational notions, worldviews and so forth within all aspects of our society. So not only formal schooling, looking at social institutions, the world of work, the world of industry, technology, and in particular the role of spirit and belief. That's the biggest place where, if you like, they've done this job on us. And in imposing their national way of life, that resulted in an attempt, they didn't quite succeed, to destroy our way of life. But we are a resilient people, and so we've always maintained some semblance of our identity and a memory of who we truly are. But it has been difficult to actually maintain that in a way that is systematic and actually can undo the structural legacies of colonialism that very much remain in Africa and the Caribbean and other parts of the African diaspora today. The mere fact, we talk about independence, let's just say in the Caribbean, where many of us, also have connections. The fact that many of these countries actually have Queen Elizabeth II as the head of state really kind of tells us what kind of independence. And we know that countries like Jamaica and Barbados have been having discussions around becoming republics. But even our judicial systems, the fact that we emulate the British judicial systems, their norms, their systems of justice and governance and Westminster parliamentary democracy, this is all part of it.
So there is a healing process required on the continent, because I think there's a kind of misunderstanding that the healing needs to take place amongst diasporians alone.
There is a misunderstanding. And there hasn't been, I feel, sufficient attention paid in recent times, in particular from so-called African leaders, to looking at redressing some of these legacies of colonialism. Because many of us have been deceived into this notion that we are free. And in a way, that's only a half-truth, because if we look at it historically, when our ancestors were in chattel slavery, freedom might have looked like so-called emancipation, removing those chains.
Physical chains, yes.
But we know now, looking back, that wasn't freedom. That was just, a changing
Releasing
of the guard,
chains,
if you like.
Brains,
exactly. And it's the same thing. So yes, this need to embark on a holistic global healing and rediscovery and actually assessment of the damage that we're still continuing to be subjected to, but also actually that some of us are now becoming perpetrators of.
Yeah, that was my next question actually, because you kind of, how do we embark on that holistic healing? I mean, has it begun from your perspective as a reparationist?
It's already begun.
Right.
The healing has already begun. Every generation has really sought to further the healing. There is a very narrow understanding of healing that is, something that we do. We take ourselves away from, we go and see a therapist or something like that, but there's actually a much deeper understanding of healing, which is tied to structural change and transformation. So in that broader sense of healing, which is to heal ourselves, which includes restoring ourselves, renewing ourselves, regenerating ourselves, and actually evolving ourselves, eradicating some of these maladaptive tendencies and behavioural patterns and mindsets that we've internalized as a result of our oppression, to actually, seeking to reclaim our humanity and our agency. How do we do it? Education is really important, and I'm not talking about formal education in schools. I'm talking about the broader context of education, drawing out of ourselves, which is within, reconnecting with our inner selves, our spirit, if people want to call it that, our place, our sense of destiny, our sense of agency, our sense of being people who actually are not here by accident. That it's not a mistake of the Creator, that actually we are here on divine purpose. And
so there is the collective, but there's the individual taking on.
Exactly,
right.
Exactly. And the collective healing is really many of the movements that have been throughout the ages to restore us. So the reparations movement really began from the time that our ancestors were kidnapped off the shores of Africa. The movement to restore, to reclaim, to restitute us, to rebuild us, to repair us began centuries ago. And throughout the generations, we've kind of taken it up a notch. And that's where we are today. So I do feel ultimately, though, it will entail many of our political and civic leaders and spiritual leaders and community leaders actually understanding and engaging much more effectively, being much more proactive around what's currently called the reparations movement, because every generation has a phase. Pan-Africanism is still there, but there was a time when it was, the movement, just like civil rights movement, black power movement. Every stage of our history, we've kind of encapsulated what our freedom struggle has been about. And in this current phase of our history, the movement is the reparations movement, which really encompasses all that has gone before. It doesn't replace it, it encompasses the whole.
So in terms of the UK perspective, particularly, the name Bernie Grant is known as being one of the activists in the UK. Do you know much about him, and can you explain a bit about what his organisation, the ARM, was about?
Well, yeah, Bernie Grant, deceased now, former Labour MP, actually of Guyanese heritage, and he became very instrumental in the current phase of the reparations movement, in particular in the 1990s. Now, he didn't originate it in the UK, but certainly because he was a member of the British Parliament, he was somebody strategically placed to actually head up a component of the global reparations movement in the UK. And so he became the chairman of what was called the African Reparations Movement UK. And the African Reparations Movement, ARM UK, was really, as I said, a UK component of what was designed to be a global movement that was initiated by African leadership arising from a conference that took place in Abuja in 1992 and also 1993. And at that conference, the Abuja conference, which was the first conference on reparations for slavery, colonialism and neo-colonialism, that was actually spearheaded and very much bankrolled by Chief Abiola of Nigeria, under the auspices of the Organisation of African Unity at the time.
Now moving now again to the Organisation of African Unity, now called AU. What's your view on the recent 50th anniversary celebrations that took place there, the 25th of May this year, if you had one?
To be quite honest, I saw it as being just another jamboree. And, I looked at the programme and it's nice on paper. This idea about reflecting, celebrating our heroes and heroines, the theme of Pan-Africanism and sort of African Renaissance again, and projecting where we want to go. So Africa, one of the key communication messages has been around Africa 2063. Trying to get Africans, especially the young Africans, because it's the youngest continent in terms of in terms of its citizenry, who are young people. So getting us to be inspired about our future. So even though those messages were very positive, what I saw once again is like what happens with a lot of these commemorations. They happen in these lofty halls, removed from the masses of our people, the everyday sufferations of our people. The majority of our people do not engage with them. If you're an international speaker, or you're an academic, or you're an artist, or you're a civic leader, fine.
It's a form of ritual.
But they don't touch our people. It becomes meaningless. And I feel, again, with these commemorations, I do believe it's important that we celebrate our progress and our achievements and acknowledge the contributions that have gone before. But I also feel that we need more honesty in our movement, because sometimes because we are so down-pressed, we just want to celebrate all the time. And I feel what's required is taking a hard, sober look at our situation, at our demise, at what's happening to us, because if we don't have clarity as to where we're at, we're going to again just be tinkering in terms of the solutions. And that's very much what I saw around these 50th commemoration celebrations and what have you that were. I don't feel that they were embedded enough in the masses of our people who are experiencing real challenges, Our people just struggling for basic survival, land struggles, all over the continent, people not having basic access to services, to water, to schooling, the basic things that we take for granted. And I feel that we need a leadership that can be courageous. As Amilcar Cabral told us, we must tell no lies and claim no easy victories. And I feel we're in a phase where we want to claim easy victories. So in doing that, we don't prepare today's generations, especially today's young people, for the sacrifice and the struggle. We don't prepare them. We make them feel that everything is going to be comfortable. And so, the comfortable is if we're living our life in Technicolor, if we're living our life on Facebook, if we're living our lives in this artificial world that has been created by the modern technology, then somehow that's progress. And that's actually a false conception of reality, because it is an artificial world. And so I do not feel enough is being done to sensitize contemporary generations as to what freedom truly means and the responsibility that is going to be required, and the sacrifice and dedication that is required for a people and a nation that truly wish to be free.
Now, the global dimensions of the movement that you mentioned there. Now, the name Marcus Garvey is significant to all of us. Explain how you see his vision for a unified and powerful Africa.
Garveyism, the UNIA, the African Communities League. Often when we look back historically, the tenets of that, we talk about race first, which is often said, nationhood, nation building, and also self-reliance are some key principles of the movement. And so when we look back at the contributions of the Garvey movement, which is still in operation today in terms of its legacies, I believe that we can say confidently that the Garvey movement's contribution was around looking at reparations as a form of, in particular, the non-repetition strategy of reparations, which was looking at the need for us to build a global superpower of the African nation. That is, I think, the contribution of the Garvey movement, if I were to just quickly summarize that. And the saying that we all know, one God, one aim, one destiny, I think is the slogan that really epitomizes that. That actually it wasn't about people of African origin in Europe alone, or in the Caribbean, or in America. Garvey and Garveyites, because it wasn't just Marcus Mosiah Garvey himself, it was all those that helped shape the movement and continued the movement, that we have to, factor into this, recognize that we were one people. We have to see ourselves as one. As it was in the beginning, so shall it be in the end. And so that is the main contribution. I spoke earlier about non-repetition being the aspect in modern times that is least emphasized. We can talk about non-repetition. There's been two kind of approaches. There's been an approach to non-repetition that says, well, the only way we can guarantee that enslavement and colonialism and all of its, degradations, racism and so forth, doesn't occur again is if we have reconciliation. And that's been a model that has been very much promoted, not only on the continent of Africa, South Africa being the typical example of a model of reconciliation. We had it in Zimbabwe, we've had it in many other African countries that have gone through internal civil conflict, but also in the diaspora. So it's about, yes, we have to reconcile with the Europeans.
But the problem I have with reconciliation is the sense of justice.
Well, exactly, but that's where I'm coming back to Garvey, because the dominant perspective around a non-repetition is the civil rights approach, reconciling in the various polities where we find ourselves today, so becoming British, becoming American, becoming whatever we are, and really trying to integrate within the mainstream European societies. The other approach to non-repetition, which is the most enduring approach that has, survived throughout the generations, has been non-repetition through nation building, through us reconnecting to our nation. And nation is not just about physical borders, it's about a peoplehood, it's about a sense of identity, it's about a sense of who we are globally. So those are the two, dominant tenets of non-repetition.
Well, that is more substantial to me, because the enduring message I've always carried from Garvey's teachings is economical development and independence. I think people without finance, and you mentioned land earlier as well, we can bleed a lot about identity, but if you have no power, which means economics, how would you view the reparations of our people in terms of economical development?
Now that's an interesting one, because if we look at the Garvey movement, again, you've mentioned the kind of economic strand, which was very strong. We know the industriousness of the Garvey movement, the industries that were developed, the black start, the corporations. This was an early model of what we could do for ourselves,
yes.
without no funding,
yes.
relying on anyone, without this kind of dependency complex that we've, this victim mentality. We did it when we were kind of much closer to chattel slavery than we are now.
Interestingly enough.
Yeah, when we had much less power, when the majority of our homeland was colonized formally. Yeah. Look at what we were able to do, but there's also a critique actually of that approach to economic building, because one of the critiques, and this again is an ideological critique, is the critique of black capitalism. And there are some views that as successful as the Garvey movement was in terms of the industriousness, it didn't actually challenge the global economic relations that had been created as a result of 500 years plus of raping our motherland, and then the benefits that went to the West, the Industrial Revolution and so forth. So yes, we were able in those times to develop institutions that were far-reaching for our people, but it was still within a global paradigm and framework that was oppressing our people.
Yes.
So I think we can take those lessons. That's not to just totally throw it out, because actually we haven't surpassed that up until this time. But now in moving forward, especially as we've had a so-called global financial crisis, which is not, it's actually a European crisis, which has been globalized because we're all locked into this system of this economic system.
And the standards that you mentioned.
And the standards, white supremacy, its economic system is capitalism. And so we have to go beyond an economic system that really actually is about profiteering, and seeking to derive, more financial benefits than really one is entitled to. And we see that in the capitalistic system, where it actually breeds so much inequality. Yes, many of our people will succeed or think they're succeeding within it, but the masses of our people remain locked out of it.
Yes.
And we see that in terms of neoliberal globalization. We see that in terms of the privatizing of lands, of industries, of many of those structures which we implemented after so-called independence, which were meant to be part of how we could economically free ourselves. But what we're seeing is totally the opposite. We're actually seeing how the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and it is about the economic system. We need to have an economic system that once again is based on principles of just interrelating, principles where we don't over extract from the earth. The extractive industries, which are very, very prevalent in Africa today, where we're literally raping the earth, which is then producing other problems in terms of environmental despoilation, huge refugee crisis. So a lot of the models of development that we are implementing at home are really not development. They're what's called, in social political studies, maldevelopment.
Yes.
And so, yes, we have to, I think, economics, oftentimes it's said that we're in the economic emancipation phase of our struggle. But I don't feel we've had enough creative thinking and models around a model of economic development that can actually end up being fair and just to the majority of our people.
I would tend to agree with you, because there is a general impression that those of us who have supposedly made it to the status of millionaires, billionaires, don't appear to be putting anything back into the African nation or the African soil.
Exactly, and then we have to look at, well, what is money anyway? This is the thing, our people get successful in a system that we don't own, that we don't control, and that we didn't create. Why is it so many of the rich and famous amongst us, especially so-called superstars, sports stars, musicians, how many of them end up bankrupt? How many of them end up, owing so-called debts? Why is this? because it just goes to show, and especially those of them that want to kind of go beyond the status quo and engage in struggles that are truly going to be emancipatory, then what you often find is that it's very easy to actually penalise them and make sure that they lose whatever economic gains that they think that they have won. And we've seen that with so many of our artists, our musicians, the famous amongst us. The minute they decide to go against the grain and step outside of that box, then actually they can be brought down. And we've seen that not just at an individual level, we've seen this in relation to our countries. Look at the strangulation that had happened with Zimbabwe. And any country that decides, no, we want to actually keep our resources for ourselves, we want to actually engage in our own form of repair by enacting legislation to redress some of the legacies of the misuse of land, and so to have land reform, then we can see the pressure that again gets put on these countries by way of economic sanctions that actually are designed to financially cripple our countries who attempt to embark on a path of alternative development. Only certain countries in Latin America, such as Cuba and Venezuela, seem to have been able to actually chart an alternative path of development. But we see that even those so-called revolutions are very much under attack today, and that's what we're faced with. So Africa, I feel, and the African diaspora has not been sufficiently creative enough, has not been sufficiently brave enough to actually take our freedom struggle, our revolution, to the next logical phase. We've still been very much caught between models of maldevelopment that are actually being pushed on us and our people back home today. And we see it, this barrel mentality where many of our family, they literally survive on the overseas remittances from their family in foreign, as they would say. So this really tells us, why is it we have a continent that is literally feeding the world, but yet our people are still starving?
Right. The organisers of this exhibition in Ethiopia, it's called Rastafari, the Majesty and the Movement. How would you sum up the benefits of this exhibition in terms of reparations?
Yeah, I think real tangible benefits are a recasting of Rastafari, a renewing of the image of Rastafari. I think elevating that, and also a replacing of the contributions of Rasta to the struggle for reparations, which is becoming very topical at this time. So I see it as being about a re-imaging, a renewing, but also a reconfiguring, and a recounting of the journey that we have taken and the contribution of Rastafari, and also His Imperial Majesty and the various legacies that come out of that, to the development and the advancement of the cause of reparations. So I think it's a very important exhibition. I see it also as being able to build bridges, because we've spoken about some of the misperceptions, the misunderstandings, the lack of awareness or knowledge or education, and the misinterpretations or misrepresentations of Rasta and the contribution. So I see it as being able to dispel some of these myths, to actually correct the narrative, and to see ourselves and a contribution of an aspect of our Pan-African family and movement building in a different light.